and welcome to Worlds Apart. The partitioning of Iraq, Libya and Syria is now being suggested by some Western policymakers as the only way out of the conflagration that the region has become. Given how many foreign policy plans have failed to produce a desirable outcome, should this one be given a try? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Dr. Ali Alawi, Iraq's former Minister of Trade, Finance and Defense after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Mr. Alawi, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Mr. Alawi, you produced a number of well-researched books, including one on the occupation of Iraq, in which you strive to provide a dispassionate analysis of what went wrong in Iraq after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. And I have to say, I really appreciated the style, the emotional discipline of your book, because you really attempted to understand rather than assign blame, which is so common in this day and age. But I have to ask you, do you think the main message of your book has managed to reach the intended audience?
Well, the audience, it was obviously written to record the history of the period and to record the events that preceded the outbreak of the war and then what happened during the occupation and subsequent to that. I think in terms of its reach, the book had quite a large reach globally, and it was read most importantly also in Iraq in its Arabic translation. But whether it affected people who made policy is something else entirely.
Well, the reason I'm asking this is because you mentioned several crucial factors that war planners didn't take into account, like, for example, the shift in sectarian balance and the consequences of the violent upending of political order. And I might be biased here, but it seems that in all the consecutive interventions in the region, whether it is Syria or Libya, the same issues were present and they didn't receive much attention either. So is it fair to say that the Iraqi engagement, as devastating as it was, didn't teach the international community much?
No, I'm afraid not. All the lessons that could have been drawn by the tragic Iraq experience were not drawn in the right measure, either in Libya and subsequently in Syria. It was basically making policy on the hoof and trying to address events of the moment rather than try to situate them into a broader context. And when you enter into a complex area like the Middle East, which has its own unique history and its own unique set of circumstances, it is absurd to try to make the kind of sweeping policies, especially that involve war and the killings and displacements of hundreds of thousands of people, simply in order to address immediate political concerns. It was done without any historical context whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Alawi, in your book, you point out that one of the reasons why war planners didn't take into account that complicated regional context was because of their over-reliance on the American military muscle. There was a belief, it seems to be, that the American military might was sufficient not only to provide security, but also to create and enforce political institutions. And obviously, after President Bush stepped down and President Obama took office, that idea rhetorically was rejected. But do you think it is still guiding the American or Western foreign policy in the region?
I don't know if it's guiding President Obama as such, but I know that there's a large and probably increasingly significant lobby inside the United States that wants to go back to using the military power of the United States as the sole or the most important contributor to change in the area. And this really has been going on, not just in the context of the Iraq War. It's been going on for decades. If you look at the Vietnam War, Senator Fulbright, who was then head of the Foreign Relations Committee, talked about the arrogance of power, which means using whatever inordinate power the United States has in order to impose a certain set of solutions without taking into account either the socio-political context or the historical context or the cultural context. And in the end, the whole thing goes up in flames and people are left holding the pieces. The same thing is happening, I'm afraid, now throughout the Middle East. It is what seems to be informing U.S. policy in the area. That is the over-reliance on the force, the military side of the equation. Now, President Obama has tried to nuance that, but whether we go back to the default position is something else we have to ponder, in fact.
Well, I think to some of us it's pretty clear, but your book on Iraq, it was published all the way back in 2007, and I think by 2011, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think there was a consensus in Washington that, this wholesale import of Western democratic institutions doesn't work, at least in the Middle East. And it doesn't work not because those institutions are bad, but exactly as you said, because of the very complicated, very sophisticated regional context. Why do you think then when that opportunity to change the regime violently came up again back in 2011 in Libya, why do you think the West seized on it? Because, I mean, again, it seems that numerous American officials did accept that the way the Iraqi affair was carried out was a mistake. So why try to repeat it again?
I think it was repeated because of basically of the inertia in which policies are made in the Western world and the effect of domestic lobbies on important issues of foreign policy, the effects of electioneering and the need to maintain electoral preponderance, sometimes even personal issues. I mean, I think these probably had a large part in the way that drove France into taking the position that it did in Libya. So it's a whole range of circumstances come into play that tend to then obfuscate or to ignore the lessons of the recent past. So the past, somebody said a week is a long time in politics, and it seems that a year is a very long time in policy making. So people just forget and try to find reasons why they should be an exceptional case in this particular incident, and why this time it would work and it would not work in the past.
Now, it's interesting you say that, because the policies on Libya and on Syria were drafted, I think, at pretty much the same time, and yet I think on Syria, the United States and the West in general took a very different policy. I mean, not different in the consequences, but I think in the way it was carried out, because there was a decision made very early on in the Syrian conflict to favor an armed rebellion rather than, let's say, military strikes. And in pursuing that policy, the United States and the West also did some power sharing with regional partners, the Gulf countries, Turkey to some extent. Why do you think that decision was made? Was it perhaps an expression of modesty on President Obama's administration, because perhaps they believed that the regional powers would contribute that regional context that was missing in previous interventions?
I think there was a great deal of opportunism in the Syrian crisis. I mean, whichever way it started, whether it was peaceful demonstrators and then suddenly met by the overweening power of the state, which seems to be the conventional story, or one in which this was, as it were, a spark that was supposed to quickly lead to a conflagration that would then quickly consume the regime in power. It was again based on grotesque miscalculations and very lack of understanding as to how these very fragile societies have worked out accommodations between the various components and communities over the last, not just decades, but in fact centuries. And here you are trying to throw a huge boulder into a pond and expecting there to be no effects. To some extent, I think the United States, which didn't play, let's say, a frontal role in the Syrian crisis at the beginning, was carried along by the interpretations as to how events were going to unfold, provided by the Gulf countries and also by Turkey, I might add, which was that this was a regime that was just ripe for falling over, and that if that regime falls, then the entire structure, as it were, that kept Hezbollah, kept Hamas, kept Iran as important players in that part of the Middle East would somehow be reversed, and in the process you would also try to win back some of the strategic losses you had in Iraq as a result of the way in which events unfolded there. So I think it was a series of gross miscalculations.
Well, gross miscalculations notwithstanding, there is one similarity that all those conflicts share. I mean, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and this is that they were initially carried out on the pretext of deposing a cruel leader. But what was interesting in your analysis is that you are one of the very few Iraqis who said that the 2003 invasion was justified on balance because it rid the world of Saddam Hussein, who towards the end of his rule, you say was genocidal, was certainly paranoid. Do you really think that deposing one cruel leader is worth all the consequences that appeared later and that we perhaps have not even comprehended at this point of time?
Well, I'd like to correct your impression. I certainly was not in favor of the war in the sense of an invasion by an outside force to overthrow the regime. I had opposed the regime of Saddam Hussein for literally decades before that, but I was neither a supporter nor an advocate of war. as a means of overthrowing the system. But once that decision was done, something to which Iraqis had little or nothing to contribute, and once the United States and its allies committed these huge forces, it was really up to them to ensure at least that the post-invasion order had elements of security and stability and sovereignty in it. Now, this is what happened subsequently to that, showed that this was not on the cards whatsoever, that the key elements that were supposed to have informed US policy, which led, in my mind, it was an outlandish act to invade a country, to cross thousands of miles of ocean and to invade a country and overthrow its system. Even the Vietnam War, I mean, I referred to that earlier, that was basically a request of a sovereign government. Here it was an invasion, and I don't think it has happened since World War II, an invasion of this kind. So we have a situation where, as Powell said, if you break it, you own it, but they refused to acknowledge or to accept responsibility for managing the affairs of the country subsequently and allowed it to slip into disaster. The same thing happened, I'm afraid, in Libya, in the sense that there's an element of truth that Mr. Muammar Gaddafi, the late Muammar Gaddafi, was not the most congenial of people or of leaders, and that his system was riddled with corruption and violence. But nevertheless, nobody thought of what's going to happen subsequently to that. And nobody could understand or appreciate the fissures and the cleavages that took place in, again, a complex tribal society. In Iraq, if you ask me now, was the invasion, can you justify the invasion of 2003 by events that happened subsequent? I'll tell you, no, you can't. But I think you have to go back and again situate it in the times of 2002, 2003, where overthrowing that system could have resulted in something better. The fact that it didn't need not necessarily make the original decision the wrong one.
Well, absolutely, Mr. Alawi, I totally agree with you. And the most painful thing here is that, again, we had one very disastrous intervention. You wrote your own book on that. There massive literature on trying to analyze that conflict, but unfortunately, all of that went in vain, and nobody really paid any attention to that. Well, Mr. Alawi, we have to take a short break now, but when we come back, a decade ago, the situation in Iraq seemed nothing short of devastating. But history shows it can always get worse. But how much worse? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are discussing Iraq and its precarious neighborhood with Dr. Ali Alawi, Iraq's former Minister of Trade, Finance and Defense after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Mr. Alawi, in relation to settling the conflict in Iraq, you used to suggest an idea of a regional Congress, where all the external players will come to the table, stake their claims, and try to come up with the lowest common denominator. And this is something that has been tried once and again in Syria, and I think it failed miserably. Do you still believe in some sort of a Versailles solution for the region as a whole?
I'm afraid I do. I mean, since the end of World War I, where we founded the modern nation-state system, the modern nation-state system in the Middle East has been singularly unstable and has not, except for very short intervals and periods of time, it has not been able to provide the security and prosperity that the citizens want. It has been one crisis after the next, culminating in the horrible situation that we have now. Now, a lot of the problems of the Middle East are sui generis. They're created by people and regimes inside and tyrants inside the boundaries of these countries. But not an insignificant part is also the cause caused by foreign powers, and we have to take that into account. So trying to create a stable system inside the Middle East that takes into account the various ethnicities and nationalities, as well as the needs and requirements of both neighbors, non-Arab neighbors, as well as the international community, I think does require some kind of international congress or conclave or whatever you want to call it. The area has huge congruence and of interest, converging interests from all kinds of players. And unless you get them together and unless all the players come into one conference room with one agenda, that is to come up with a stable, long-term political and, I might add, economic order for the area, we will not have any stability. Now, we had some form of stability in World War II, after World War II in Europe, where Europe was divided effectively under the control of two superpowers, and an order of sorts was imposed, and that created the conditions for development and growth, and then led to the formation of these pan-European institutions that we all know about. The Middle East, I don't think, is much different right now. And if you want to solve the problems of Syria without solving the problems of Iraq, or if you want to solve these issues piecemeal, I don't think you'll get a kind of lasting harmony.
I'm sorry, Mr. Alawi, I just wanted to clarify, even if international players manage to come up with some sort of gentleman's agreement on how to behave in the region, I think what remains is the question of the region's political organization. And I think it is pretty clear at this point of time that the idea of a liberal democracy, at least in the Western sense, as you just alluded to, is not very viable at this point of time, neither in Iraq nor perhaps in Libya or Syria. I even heard you say that the adversarial politics that tends to be associated with liberal democracy in the West may actually be detrimental for the region, because it would not be theatrical as it is in the West. It would only exacerbate existing ethnic, perhaps sectarian tensions. So the question again, what is the alternative? Because I don't think anyone would agree to the autocratic models. I mean, after all those revolutions, people would want to have some representative government, but the question again remains, what could that government be like?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is to remove what one would call the existential threats to the area, which is ISIS, as well as the underlying ideology that is now unfortunately prevalent in large parts of the Muslim world, which is the ideology of Wahhabism and Jihadi Salafism. It has taken deep roots in large swathes of the Muslim community in the Middle East, and it is a very serious ideational issue that has to be confronted head-on. In the case of ISIS and the jihadi elements, it has to be by force. In the case of the ideology of Wahhabism, it has to be countered directly, and it has to be countered also at its source, so that at the end of the day, you don't have the ground anymore for this kind of ideology that calls for the destruction and the obliteration of the other. Without that, I think this is by far the most important starting point. Once this is achieved, once you take off these existential threats, the next step, I think, is to try to weave back the forms in which people maintained and accommodated these differences in order to recreate, to reknit the social framework that allowed for some degree of some political stability. Without that, I think we're doomed.
Mr. Alawi, you just said that the Wahhabi ideology has to be tackled at its source, and I wonder what that source really is, because as barbaric as ISIS actions may seem to us, some of them are part of the policies of certain states in the region, and those certain states do have a role in all the dynamics, all the sort of trends that going on in the region. I mean, it's been reported that IS is distributing official books published in Saudi Arabia within its territory. So I wonder, how far do you think the international community can afford to go as far as, trying to get to the source of the problem?
No, I mean, this has to be, in my mind, criminalized. There's no way around it. I mean, this is an ideology that calls for the destruction of the other groups that they don't consider to be within the ambits of Islam are fair game. You're talking about the Middle East now, where half the population is non-Sunni Muslim. What are you supposed to do with them? Kill them all? So we have to accept the fact that a lot of this is propounded within the academies of Saudi Arabia. It's promoted by the state as part of its foreign policy, and it has had disastrous effects. Now, it may not have affected yet Western Europe or the United States, or maybe even Russia, but still, it's something that is germinating, and that if it takes control over the states, disintegrating states of the area, it can have tremendous repercussions, both inside the Middle East and outside. Now, their theory is that, fine, we will use these people against our enemies, but once we get rid of our enemies, we will then be able to contain them. This is really, I think, one of the most silly ways of some countering this kind of extremist thinking. It has nearly destroyed states, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the Muslim world. And it has done so in the most dramatic and tragic fashion in Iraq and now in Syria. And if the international community does not wake up to its responsibilities, then it's allowing the propagation of a hateful ideology that shows no mercy and no willingness to tolerate and accommodate
Okay.
other groups within its ambit.
Mr. Alawi, but let me press you a little bit on that, because ISIS is believed to be a group that is composed of many former Iraqi army officers, and I don't think they could be easily portrayed as barbaric and totally irrational and unhinged as we tend to see them on TV screens. My question to you is whether you believe indeed that the former Ba'ath Party of Iraq does contribute a lot of its people, did contribute a lot of its people to the core of ISIS, and if that's indeed the case, can they be negotiated with? Can they be reasoned with?
Yes, but I don't think it's an either-or situation. I mean, it's not you're a former regime official or a former regime intelligence operative or officer, or you are a nihilist, jihadist, takfiri, a person who wants to destroy all ahead of him, all in front of him. It can be both. Now, a lot of the people inside ISIS were former regime elements, there's no doubt about that. But a lot of them became radicalized, and a lot of them found some kind of grotesque synthesis between Arab nationalism and between this Wahhabi extremism, and have managed to merge the two together. So you can't really disentangle them now. There are former elements of the military and security forces that are in leadership positions in ISIS, but at the same time, they were converted to this ideology and became proponents of it, and they were converted not today or yesterday, throughout the 1990s, and then this was worsened under the conditions of incarcerations that the Americans had. So to me, you have a system now, an ISIS system, which has as its working ideology not Baathism or Arab nationalism. It's not driven only by the need for those former elements to come back to power. That's part of it. But it's also driven by a worldview. It's also driven by a view that sees a large number of people who are citizens of the country somehow outside of the pale and should be either completely discriminated against or destroyed. So they believe in that. They believe in this way of looking at the world, and they have tons and tons of fatwas and confirmations and justifications provided for them by so-called clerics and so-called religious leaders scattered throughout the Middle East, but primarily in the Gulf area and Saudi Arabia. Now the Saudis have to take responsibility for this, and they have to take responsibility for teaching and for promoting this kind of nonsense that leads to mass murder and leads to slaughter and enslavement and rapine. But what I'm trying to say is that ISIS is no longer simply an organization of the Ba'ath Party by another name. That's not true. It has its own momentum, and that momentum is driven by and large by its own peculiar, grotesque conception of the world.
Mr. Alawi, their actions are nothing short of barbaric, but I think the history shows us that many of the regimes that seized power through violence, they do tend to be very radical at the beginning, but as they have to deal with, the business of running the state, they do tend to become more moderate. I mean, the history of my own country, I think, is very instructive if you go back to the origins of the Russian Revolution. Now, I think there is a consensus now, even in the West, that you cannot deal, or you cannot fully exterminate ISIS only by air raids. So shouldn't they then be given a try at governance?
Well, ISIS will not be destroyed by air power. That's true. It will not be destroyed also by uprisings in Mosul and other towns and cities under their control and administration. And it will not be destroyed by the very weak and fragmented forces that are arrayed against it, both in Syria and in Iraq. The Iraqi state right now is in no position to defeat ISIS. We have to involve, if not international powers, at least regional powers, or at least give enough time and space for countries like Iraq to reconfigure their armed forces and to grow their capability to meeting this threat. Now, whether the rest of the world is prepared to cooperate with them, I think most of the world accepts certain de facto situations. I mean, the world worked with the Taliban throughout the 1990s. Only 2 countries, or 3 countries perhaps, recognize them as a functioning state, Saudi Arabia being one of them. But you can have a kind of proto-state functioning in the territories that ISIS controls. They may be able to contain their expansionist energies. They may be able to also generate the resources locally to be able to manage a kind of state. And you will have some kind of short-term equilibrium. But no state that is driven by this kind of ideology can possibly be considered a source of security and stability for its neighbors. And sooner or later, it will spill over. So we're just postponing the issue, kicking the can down the road, as the Americans say.
Well, Mr. Alawi, I think we've been doing that, you know, if by we I mean the international community. I think we've been doing this for quite some time in Iraq as well. I just want to mention before we have to end this program that the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency has recently been forced to declassify its 2012 report in which it discusses the prospect of a Salafist municipality in eastern Syria, and it actually saw that municipality at that time as a strategic asset toward regime change in Syria. So, you know, just 3 years ago, that prospect was quite admissible, if not desirable overall. So I wonder if, you know, if this is something that we will have to contend with right now.
I mean, this is, you can call this realpolitik, you can call this some kind of cynical or cynical realism, but you can be cynically realistic and be idiotic at the same time. I think this is an idiotic policy, even though it's based on, well, let's deal with the facts as they are and leave the contentious issues later on. It is a very, very short-term perspective on what is, I think, an existential problem, not only facing the Arab countries, but facing Islam generally. Throughout the world, the 1.4 billion Muslims have to contend whether this ideology has any truth to it. And if it does, then I think the rest of the world is going to be in for a very bumpy ride. We must not allow a state like that to continue to exist and to espouse this kind of thinking without countering it at all levels.
I'm afraid we have already allowed that to happen to some extent in the international community. But unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I really appreciate your being on the show. And to our viewers, please share your thoughts on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.